Hi guys, Rod from Medsodium Thought Videos here, and in today's video I want to begin a short series on the metaphysics of science. Okay, so I've changed the thumbnail title to the Metaphysics of Physics just to get a more poetic effect. Now, metaphysics is really a branch of philosophy that deals with the ultimate nature of things, and in this video it is to philosophy that I want to now turn. Although many modern scientists don't give the subject of philosophy a second thought, I would argue that the scientific method itself is a child of a philosophical framework which consists of a minimum of 4 philosophical presuppositions and 2 intellectual tools that are assumed to be useful for understanding the odd reality in which we all find ourselves. Now, like all children, as they grow to full maturity, they often become less complimentary about their parents who brought them into being, and this is definitely the case with science and its relationship to its own father, philosophy. In particular, there is a new and often very vocal type of scientist who often berates theism because they think science holds the answer to everything. Such folk do not like to consider the question of whether the methodology of science itself might have some intellectual boundaries, and since those boundaries, when they do occur, are set by science's parent, philosophy, often you atheists can be very surprisingly aggressive against philosophers, almost as much as they are towards theists. To cite one example, when Lawrence Krauss released his book A Universe from Nothing, he was criticized by the philosopher David Albert. Krauss was not amused, calling Albert a moronic philosopher, saying that philosophers are threatened by science because science progresses, philosophy doesn't. Krauss is not the only scientist who feels that philosophy can now be consigned to the history as an impotent pre-scientific attempt to try and grasp reality. As I've already mentioned, this attitude is somewhat ironic, given that at the heart of science are 4 indispensable presuppositions or axioms which originate completely from the discipline of philosophy. So let's now take a look at the 4 indispensable philosophical assumptions that are critical to the scientific method. I have come up with a single word for each of them, all beginning with the letter C. My 4 words are coexistence, coherence, correspondence, and conservation. In this video, I shall deal with the first 2, while covering correspondence and conservation in next week's thought video. So my first word, coexistence, is a one-word summary for the following more formal presuppositional statement. There is a cosmos that is independent of ourselves and about which our senses give reliable information. This first assumption of the scientific method is made on the sensible basis that the reality in which we find ourselves does not depend on our existence. In other words, the laws of the universe and everything in it existed before we were born and will continue to do so after we have died. To put it bluntly, we reject the hypothesis that our reality is a fake creation of our own minds. In other words, we are not like those in the movie The Matrix, bodies or brains in a bottle, which are being fed data to make us think we live in a place with externally real objects and people. Closely related to this concept, we also assume that all other humans experience the same form of phenomenological consciousness and self-awareness that we experience. Like the independent existence of a reality that is external to our own psyche, this assumption is also impossible to prove in any meaningful way. Perhaps all those folk you interact with on a day-to-day basis are in fact unconscious algorithms that so effectively mimic human behavior that you just assume that they are, like you, a fully self-aware, conscious person. At this point, someone might object and say, surely it would be easy to tell the difference between an unconscious algorithm that was programmed to mimic human behavior and the genuine human article. Well, I'm not so sure. Humans have a very strong propensity to anthropomorphize, assigning human characteristics to entities that interact with us even in very simple ways. Anyone who has played with one of those toy dinosaurs or other children's toys that are programmed to replicate basic social interactions will know what I'm talking about in terms of being tempted to imagine the toy has some form of independent presence. Incidentally, this is also why I'm not a fan of defining human consciousness based on the Turing test, because by definition, the only person we can prove is truly conscious in the sense that the only consciousness we ever experience is ourselves. In relation to all other people on the face of the earth, we just assume that their experience of conscious presence is identical to ours. Incidentally, this thought is also the basis of the famous maxim of Descartes, "I think, therefore I am." Descartes claims that this is the only statement that can be made which truly does not rely on any underlying presuppositions. The reason is because it is simply based on definitions and logic. We can show this by first defining existence. We define existence as anything which is, and which therefore can be defined. The second definition is thought, which, for our purposes, is any mental activity including the act of defining. So it follows that thought must be a subset of existence, since it can be defined. We just did it above. Now, when we make or think the above statement, then it follows that we do exist because we have shown that thought resides in the category of existence, and so we who think must also reside there. Okay, now you've thought about that for a little bit, we are ready to consider the coherency axiom of science. We begin our examination of this principle by recasting what I've just said before about Descartes' famous "I think, therefore I am" statement. So we shall recast it as follows, and listen carefully. The first definition is existence. We define existence as anything which is, and which therefore can be defined. The second definition is thought, which for our purposes is any mental activity, including the act of defining. So it follows that thought must not be a subset of existence, since it can be defined. We just did it above. Now, when we make or think the above statement, then it follows that we do not exist, because we have shown that thought resides in the category of existence, and so we who think must also not reside there. The only change I've made to what I said before is to add the word "not" 3 times. In doing so, I have created a statement which is completely inconsistent with itself. For I have defined existence as anything that is, and which can be defined. I define thought as any mental activity, including the act of defining. But now I say, despite the fact that thought has been defined, and I've defined existence as anything that can be defined, that thought is not a subset of existence. This is a simple contradiction of the definitions I've just created. Thus, the statement is logically incoherent. Logical incoherence is also the basis of many funny jokes. For instance, you may have seen this one during the email rounds about 15 years ago. Prosecution: "Did you see the accident?" Witness: "Yes." Prosecution: "What happened?" Witness: "The cars collided head on." Prosecution: "And how far apart were the cars when they collided?" I hope you laughed at that one. In other words, science itself is grounded in the axiom that all scientific theories must be logically consistent, containing no internal contradictions. You might be tempted to think this statement is obvious, but as is so often with fundamental axioms, we are so used to seeing them obeyed in practice that we almost become blind to the fact they are part of the formalism that controls how science itself operates. So with that, I have just given you the first and second presuppositional statements of science. I'm going to call the coherency principle, however, the zero law, because it is even more fundamental than our coexistence law, which was the first presupposition that I presented to you today. Okay, so that is my thought video for this week. Next week, we shall move on to consider my remaining 2 axioms, correspondence and conservation. In the meantime, if you like this video, please do hit the like key, and if you want to see more of my content, then please do subscribe to my channel by hitting the subscribe button and the bell notification key below. Until next time, I hope your body and mind are in a good place. Bye for now.